When I was asked to say a few words this evening, I was thinking about how I could connect this wonderful anthology about World War I with the broader subject of the first 35 years of LOA, how those two things seemed to come together. And it occurred to me, after some thought, that there was a single and striking way in which they did come together. And that was around the figure of that other great American Wilson, not Woodrow, who Scott has told us and instructed us so much about, but Edmund. Edmund Wilson, my great predecessor at The New Yorker, and one of the foundational figures, if not indeed the foundational figure, in the making of the Library of America. As many of you know, it was Wilson who had the insistent notion that America deserved a Pleiad of its own. He had in mind the great French series, which continues to this day, in which standard editions of all of the classic writers are available in relatively inexpensive, standardized, and reliable form. It seemed to him scandalous that no such equivalent existed for the United States, and he made it his special mission to bring about an American Pleiad, and Library of America is and has succeeded in being exactly that and more than that. I'll say more about that in a moment. But one of the crucial things when we think about Edmund Wilson and his evolution and the arc of his career is that it exactly pivots on the experience of the First World War. Because Wilson saw that the First World War, the Great War, as it was known, had altered culture in an absolutely vital, permanent, and in many respects catastrophic way. That the modernist art and literature that he so keenly admired and in many respects was the first critic to bring to the United States depended on the rupture in civilization that had been created by the Great War. Many responses poured out, the anarchic responses of Dada, the heartbroken responses of Siegfried Sassoon or Robert Graves in England. But Wilson recognized that that had been where the first and primal, painful energies of the thing we call modernity had begun. And Wilson recognized something else that was peculiar to us in America, and that was that we as Americans, and as Scott Berg's anthology makes so plain, we had, as the songs we just listened to moments ago make plain, we had a double experience of that moment and of that war, where it was an unmitigated catastrophe for France and England and Germany. For us, it had a double meaning. On the one hand, a place where far too many were killed and brought home dead, but it was also a moment of cultural emancipation. It was a moment of American pain, but it was also the crucial moment of American arrival, when for the first time, Americans felt themselves capable, in literature above all, of rivaling and outdoing their European counterparts and predecessors. It was exactly the moment when Ernest Hemingway felt that he was ready to go 8 rounds with Mr. Maupassant and beat him. That's the background of Wilson's dream of a Library of America, of a Pleiad. It was exactly through that moment of American arrival that Wilson and the generation that included Van Wyck Brooks, for instance, realized that not only would you have to understand and sponsor and promote the writing of the new generation of Hemingway and Dos Passos and Wilson's dear friend Fitzgerald in America, and a broader range of writers who included, for Wilson, as is sometimes forgotten, Dawn Powell and Anita Luce and Dorothy Parker. But one would also have to rethink the American past and what we took from it. And if you read through Wilson's remarkable writing from the New Yorker in the 1940s, half of it is devoted to explaining to people who Nabokov and Kafka are, and the other half is devoted to explaining to Americans why Edgar Allan Poe is a great and major writer, not simply a maker of scary stories, why Melville is a towering figure in world literature, not simply the guy who wrote the book about the whale. As Harold Ross famously wrote on the galley of that piece of Wilson's, is Moby Dick the man or the fish? Wilson explained why it was the man who wrote the book about the man and the fish. In all of those ways, Wilson's idea of a Library of America was simultaneously a present tense idea and a past tense idea. And in all of those ways, that's the thing that those of us who love and cherish this institution and organization continue to pursue. There does seem to be one significant difference between the idea of Library of America, of an American Pleiad as it was first put forward by Wilson and his contemporaries, and the form that it has taken and the ideals that it has realized in those 35 years. For the one thing that I don't think anyone could have adequately anticipated in the early 1980s was the extraordinarily broad range and spectrum of literature that would be included in that American Pleiad. This is not simply a constellation of American stars. This is the entire American cosmos represented on paper. The Library of America has, with extraordinary boldness and conviction, and I ask you all to salute Max and Jeffrey and Cheryl and the rest of the extraordinary team who did that. The Library of America has evolved not only has brought us standard editions of Melville and Twain and Howells, anthologies of Americans in Paris, of the experience of the First World War, they've also brought unequivocally and boldly and courageously into the mainstream of the American canon detective fiction, science fiction, horror stories, the full range of American expression, musical, my favorite form, in fact, the musical lyrics and musical theater, and have recognized that these things are every bit as much a part of the articulation of American culture as the great masters of American literature are. That was a decision that took great boldness and it took great conviction. It's a decision that I think Edmund Wilson would have applauded, because though Wilson is sometimes wrongly represented as a grand and stuffy pigeon, in fact, if you read his work, no one vibrated more readily to the highest moments in American popular culture than Wilson. One of the first to write about James M. Cain, one of the first to see Hollywood as a great subject in the hands of a Fitzgerald or an Anita Luce, one of the people who understood that the prime roots of American culture, as he wrote memorably in a review of Gene Fowler's book about John Barrymore, had always to resonate with Broadway and Hollywood in the American street. In all of those ways, I think we're blessed to have a Library of America that has taken on that larger task and has seen its role not simply to enshrine and preserve, but to enlarge and protect. I said not long ago that it seemed to me that Library of America had stumbled on a nearly perfect name in its evolution, because in those three words, it seems to sum up everything that we value and that we think about when we think about American culture and American civilization. First, the idea of a library. We take libraries entirely for granted, but when we think about the role of the library, of the free library, as my native library in Philadelphia is called, in making American culture, it still astounds us. You only have had to live in France, as I was privileged to do for many years, to know the difference between getting your library card for the great French National Library and getting your library card for the New York Public Library, to understand something of the difference between a democratic culture and a culture that still remains heavily hierarchical. It is harder to get a reading card for the Bibliothèque Nationale than it is to get an American passport, and it is easier to get a ticket to go into the great reading room of the New York Public Library than it is to get a Metro card. That's an astounding accomplishment, an astounding difference. And when we think about the lives of the founders of America, we realize again how significant the library is to their making. Alexander Hamilton, whose double presence, both in a volume here at Library of America and as the newly minted star of Broadway, the one man my 17-year-old daughter most admires and wants to imitate. Hamilton and his Confederates depended on inventing a library of their own, the library that now still persists as New York Society Library, in order to give foundation to their own change. They recognized that a library still controlled by king and church was inadequate to their own ambitions. Libraries in America are hugely important. And then I have a special affection for the word of, because it seems to me the most misaccented word in the history of American rhetoric. And I'm thinking, of course, about the greatest single piece of American rhetoric, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which is almost always accented at the end, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Where, of course, the sense of it is that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. The of is the thing we take for granted. There will always be government of the people. The question is, will it be by and for the people? The three should never be equally stressed. We take government for granted. Democracy is the accomplishment. Popular government is the accomplishment of immense fragility. And finally, there is the word America. Now, my dirty secret is that I am actually Canadian. And as Canadians, of course, US citizen now for many a year, as Canadians, of course, we take the word America with a certain degree of scandalous offense. America is shared by many, and all Canadians, as you know, never refer to the place we are as America. We refer to it merely as the States. You're going down to the States, are you? You come from the States. You live in the States, because we all live in America. But the idea of America, undefined, unlimited by specific geographic constraints, remains an enormously rich one. Exactly because, as the Library of America has revealed to us for the past 35 years, it is an idea that is forever in contest, forever expanding, forever evolving, forever changing. The idea of America that Edmund Wilson began with in the 1920s when he wrote his masterpieces, Axel's Castle, later when he wrote The Wound and the Bow, is very different from the idea of America that we stand and share today. That's not a story of mindless relativism. That's a story of the constant acquisition of a broader and more capacious sensibility. Scott Berg said with such truth that the fundamental question of the Great War, the First World War, was the question of identity. And I would add that it was a tragedy, a catastrophe of identity in many ways, when the great cosmopolitan civilization of Europe in 1914, what was then called the Concert of Europe, fragmented on the rocks exactly of the insistence on narrow assertion of national identity in favor of the constant search for a broader shared cosmopolitan union. We live at a time when that sense of cosmopolitanism has perhaps never been as threatened as it is today in our own country. When the wrong idea of identity, identity not rising from the reality we share, not articulated as part always of double identity, of positive shared identity, of the polyglot and plural identity that we all seek for, but narrowly in terms of simple, monolithic, and vengeful identity. Never in American history has the specifically American idea of identity been so jeopardized and so threatened as it is today. And so, it seems to me that never before have we needed those three words in their neat and potent collision. Libraries to open our minds, ofs to remind us that we have to choose how to be governed, and a broadly capacious idea of America that takes in the broadest possible number and plurality of identities that the world brings to it. I ask you to celebrate with me 35 years of something that means more than three words, the Library of America. Thank you.